Introduction, and I'm just really honored to be here and to meet so many new folks. People sometimes ask me how I got involved in peace advocacy, and I usually tell them it was a survival strategy. I grew up as an Arab American Catholic altar boy, and now I work for the Quakers. And if you can broker peace between Arab family dinners, Catholic guilt, and an hour of Quaker silence, global diplomacy starts to be a bit more manageable. Yeah. But in all seriousness, I am honored to receive recognition from Pax Christi and honored to get a warm introduction from David. Before I begin, I just want to dedicate these remarks to my aunt Layla. Layla is Palestinian. In 1967, during the war, her family was forcibly displaced from her home in the West Bank, and they left believing that it would just be temporary, days, maybe weeks, but unfortunately she was never able to return to Palestine. She grew up carrying that loss, and to this day she has cousins and relatives in Palestine that she's never met in person. And not because she doesn't want to, because movement is restricted and borders are controlled, and the system is keeping families apart. Her story shaped how I understood injustice, and it also shaped how I understood myself. My name is Hassan. In Arabic, Hassan actually means beautiful. Some people think that's a misnomer, but that's okay. But growing up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, it also meant I would be a bit of a target. I could name a lot of examples, but in my social studies class, sophomore year of high school, I sat behind this kid named Mike, and every day he would call me racial slurs that I don't want to utter here. My teachers would just sit there, other students wouldn't intervene, and folks whose job it was to protect me and other vulnerable students just didn't say anything. And that was my first lesson in power. And anti-Arab racism was my first call to action. My parents separated when I was young. I grew up primarily with my Italian mom. I had limited contact with my father, and so these Arab roots that I had, I was being bullied for, I had almost no connection to. And that was a special kind of isolation that I was dealing with, and something, I was ashamed of something that I barely even knew. And then came September 11th. We watched those attacks in my college dorm room. I was horrified by the violence. I was horrified again by the wars that followed, and my dad, actually, speaking of New York City, lived in Riverdale in the Bronx, and I was worried, like, what happened? He's Jordanian, but maybe he was impacted. I called up, he was safe, but it was just devastation that no one wanted to see. And these were wars against people that looked and sounded like my family from Jordan. And I still didn't really know who I was. And if I wanted to stop carrying shame about this identity that I had, I think at a certain point I needed to understand where I came from. So in 2007, I bought a ticket, flew out to Jordan for the first time as an adult. My father picked me up in Amman. I drove to Madaba and down a dirt road. I went to a bunch of houses that were all belonging to the El-Tayyab family. This is my clan, and I was greeted by dozens of relatives, a huge meal, and really more kisses than I could count. And I realized something important, that I hadn't just missed them for 20 years, they had actually missed me too. One morning I mentioned that I wanted to go downtown for breakfast. I don't know about your Arab relatives, but mine, they eat the same food every day. and I wanted something different, so I told my dad, and I was just like, let's just go get some scrambled eggs. Can we just do that, My dad said, okay, go wake up your uncle. And so my uncle drove a tour bus, and this is 7 a.m., and all of a sudden I'm on the tour bus, and all of my family start piling into the tour bus and to get me some scrambled eggs. I'm like, okay, wow, they got the whole crew coming. My cousin Youssef, again, now it's like 7:15, he grabs a microphone and starts singing a Bedouin song that I will absolutely butcher, but it's like, Yola Subu Helga Hawazi Duha Hel. I think I maybe got some of that right. The whole bus joined in, the windows were down, people on the street were singing around, And then, they're feeling good. I later learned that this was about good Jordanians drinking coffee and riding horses. Okay. So my cousin turns to me, he says, Hassan, you're a songwriter, sing us an American song. I'm like, oh God. Panicking, I was like, no, you guys got it. You guys got this, it's all good. No, they kept it, and then they all started chanting my name. I'm like, okay. The only thing I could think of was Hit the Road Jack. and somehow the whole bus joined in, and they were laughing, broken English, and joy was spilling out everywhere. Somewhere in that trip, I started to loosen up some of the shame that I felt. I said, wow, these people are incredible, incredibly generous. And it just scratched my head. I'm like, why are we going to war with people in the Middle East? People that are innocent, people that just want to live with dignity. They have no issues with the United States, and they just wanted to live in peace. And somewhere in that trip, I think, led me to my journey to Washington, D.C. I now work in Congress for FCNL and help lead the U.S. Ceasefire Coalition. It's a network of more than 150 national organizations working for a ceasefire, trying to end the genocide, end all the suffering going on. And when I first arrived, the Israel-Palestine space was pretty saturated, and I went there to actually work to try to end the crisis going on in Yemen, because that was also deeply disturbing. And I asked my boss, Robert Naiman, the then director of Just Foreign Policy, I was like, okay, I'm going to DC. What's my job description? He said, end the Yemen war. I was like, oh, is that all? Okay. We were pushing for war powers resolutions, forcing votes, forcing debates, and forcing members of Congress to go on record about a war most Americans weren't seeing. And what I learned was something very, very valuable. And that even when these votes and resolutions don't quite cross the threshold of where they need to go, they still matter. The process matters, and they change the political conditions surrounding the war. In 2019, the Yemen War Powers Resolution passed through both chambers. Folks here may remember that. That was absolutely incredible, but tragically, and we assumed it would happen, but President Trump 1.0 vetoed that resolution. But just before that, I was just astounded. The administration effectively moved to cut off that military aid to the Saudis anyway, essentially saying, you can't force us to end support for the war because we're stopping it anyway. The political pressure worked. And that was a time that I started to really understand how power in Washington, D.C. works, and that these votes aren't just symbolic, they changed the cost of war, and Yemen became the precedent. Flash forward. After October 7, I got a call from a friend in Gaza, and he said, you have to do something. And I wasn't sure exactly what to do. This was a big ask. And 1 week later, I said, you know what, we gotta get more people calling for a ceasefire, because this is disturbing. We knew where this was gonna go. And FCNL, along with JVP, AMP, and AFSC, and CMEP, we co-led an advocacy letter calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, even as the Biden administration publicly described a ceasefire as repugnant. They used that word. And we knew we couldn't wait for perfect conditions. We know that there was a lot of emotions behind what was going on, but we just knew the violence had to stop. And after that, we built the Ceasefire Coalition. There's a global Ceasefire Now coalition, and they asked for someone to step up and lead the US branch of this in DC. And I said, you know what? This is a contentious issue. Let's keep it simple. We just said, if folks can agree on two simple principles, then they belong here. Ahlan wa sahlan, and if not, ma salama. I'll let you guys figure out what that translation means. We want an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and we want the protection of all civilians, whether or not they're Israeli or Palestinian. They all deserve to live in safety. That clarity, I believe, is what allowed us to grow this to 150 national organizations. We now have like 400 folks in the network. And it keeps growing each week. We have barely missed a week since we started, and it's been going a long time. And people were looking for a space where those principles were not negotiable and that they were safe to be in that space and share their opinions, even if they don't agree on everything. Some people want a two-state. Some people want the one state. Some people want, even a different federation. Some people wanted weapons to continue, and then some of those same folks actually changed their view on that. And we said, let's build a big tent. And the momentum in Congress has followed. It's always going to trail behind where the grassroots are. And there was a time when there were no recorded votes on restricting U.S. weapons transfers to the Israeli government. And then there was a few, and then some more. We essentially went from 0 to 11 to 19 to 27, and now 40 senators just voted to block arms sales to the Israeli government. These are D9 Caterpillar bulldozers. You can clap for them. And unfortunately, none of those senators live in New York. We'll have to work on that after the speech. Every Democratic hopeful for president voted in support. And that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And just this past week, we saw the House of Representatives vote in support and finally passed the Iran War Powers Resolution. After months and months of forcing votes and debates and activists like the ones in this room showing up, thankfully your senators have voted for that one. So give them a kudos where it belongs. But that's not a coincidence. That's because activists continue to make the point that we don't want to be involved in a war of choice against Iran. We want diplomacy to end the real challenges that I'm not saying that everything's figured out, but diplomacy, I truly believe, is the only way to solve these issues that are very intractable. So, I have been to Israel and Palestine twice since the war began. In Ramallah, we met with students at the Friend School, and their questions weren't abstract. I had a whole speech prepared, and then I basically took my speech, I just tossed it out. I said, I have nothing to really say. I need to stop talking and listen, which is very difficult for a lobbyist. And they told me one after another what their lives were like. One of them asked, hey, why does the United States continue to send bombs and military assistance? One of the kids, I think we know his cousin in Vermont who is paralyzed from a hate crime from a deranged person. And I met his third grade cousin at the Ramallah Friend School, and he started crying, and he said, can you tell people in the United States to stop crimes of hate against Palestinians? He was bawling, and his teacher gave him a big hug, and I just was torn up by that. And at night, we could hear gunfire and aircraft overhead, and we just knew that, there's a lot of work to do. And this is the gap that we're seeing. In between policy and lived realities, you start to understand what these votes really mean. While I was there, the Senate actually voted on that first 502B resolution. This is to require the State Department to force a human rights report on Israel's war crimes going on in Gaza and the West Bank. It received 11 votes, and one 8th grader said, well, that's 11 more senators than I thought who supported Palestinian human rights. I wrote that down because that child understood something that many members of Congress don't, is that when they say things, it has a ripple effect around the world that we don't always see. And the helpers are everywhere. I met plenty of Israeli helpers, people that were doing protective presence in the West Bank, putting their lives on the line, folks like Combatants for Peace and Breaking the Silence. I met others, Palestinian helpers. I think about Nisreen, an UNRWA staffer I met on one of those trips, doing really incredible advocacy. I was on a trip. UNRWA was kind enough to put me in their shuttle and drop me off at my uncle's house in Jordan. Because if you think there's problems between Israelis and Palestinians, if I didn't go visit my Aunt Layla, there would be a lot of problems. So I had to go visit Jordan. But she was just incredible. She was helping arrange medical evacuations for Palestinian patients to receive care around the world. They had evacuated one by one and doing the hard diplomatic work that our State Department should be doing, frankly, to evacuate 50 children that are now alive today because of her work. And she showed me pictures of kids with these burns, amputated limbs, and things I will just never forget. And you know, she told me something that really just stopped me in my tracks. She said, you know, many of the families, we said, hey, there's a hospital in Florida that these folks can go to, and she said, you know, they say they don't want to come to the United States. They're too afraid to come to the United States, and they don't feel safe here. And just sit with that for a moment. They would rather take their chances in Gaza than come to the United States to get medical care. I mean, that is frankly disgusting to me as an American. I praised her for everything that she was doing, and she looked at me and said, I'm doing it to not surrender to the fact that there is no justice. And that, I have to admit, I'm not as courageous or brave as Nisreen. After that trip, I hit a wall. I said, you know, after years of sharing these calls, absorbing the reports, the stories I heard from the kids, I really began to lose hope, and I was trying not to let the coalition know that I was just like, just a drone, just showing up, just like trying to keep it together. And just the weight of that, it really just became absolutely overwhelming, and I was having trouble. And I didn't know if I had anything left to give. I was actually thinking about like passing, you know, just saying, hey, others just need to finish this. But I did what a lot of people do in August recess. I leave DC, and that was a great idea. I actually went to Barcelona for 2 weeks. I just needed to breathe. And one afternoon, I found myself walking alone in the crypts of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona and hearing the story about Gaudi and his extraordinary basilica and all the work that he did to bring that up. And you know, he's been working on this he worked on it for 40 plus years. And then tragically, he died, but he knew that future generations would continue that work. And in that crypt, while I was hearing this story, I said, wow. I had an epiphany. I basically started crying there and realizing that he laid the foundations and trusted that others would finish what he began. And something clicked again. You know, peace work is not something you finish. It's something that you contribute to. You lay the stones, and we know that others will have to continue the work. And we're laying the stones because we love Palestinian and Israeli children that haven't even been born yet, that don't want to live in a world of endless war. So I came home and was ready to keep building. I just absolutely believe in peace. And you may have noticed I asked, you know, I've actually never gotten an award like this. I normally try to not do that thing. But they said, well, you want an image on this thing, and I'll be honest with you, I'm agnostic. And so there was a lot of these images that were very religious, but I saw a picture in that group of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he is one of my all-time heroes. And I'll tell you why. I last year, after that trip, I read a book called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. And he writes that each of us needs to cultivate parts of ourselves. Our inner meditator, our inner warrior, and our inner artist. The meditator keeps us grounded. The warrior keeps us strong, and the artist keeps our ideas fresh. And he was describing exactly what this work needs. Because if we don't do that internal work, we show up burned out. We show up reactive. We show up depleted. We risk creating more suffering by the very peace advocacy we're trying to advance. And the world doesn't need more angry peace activists. We need people that have done that internal work. So tonight, my ask is simple, but it's not small. We need to become the spark plugs for change to save our democracy and to save our planet and to end these wars in the Middle East. And I am inspired to be in a room with people that have done the work and that are inspiring me to keep going. And in organizing, I call people spark plugs when they are the energetic catalyst who initiates undertaking, ignites passion in others, and jumpstarts a stalled movement. They're not necessarily the loudest, but they are so important. Hold a second. So, I had something here. So we need to become the spark plug for change. And we're in a moment where there's incredible authoritarianism going on, polarization, but I just think that we have something that they don't have, which is each other. We have love for each other, and we have the passion to keep going. I will continue going with every last fiber of my being until we end these wars in Lebanon, Iran, Gaza, the West Bank, until we actually have peace. And I just am so grateful again to David. Thank you to Pax Christi. And I hope to keep getting to know everybody. Thank you all.